Hello and welcome back to Heaven and Health. And I welcome back to Terri Hutchinson. And this is, for those of you who don't know, a couple weeks ago, every other week she is co-hosting with me. And this week we are talking about emotional health. And so this week we're talking about boundaries. So boundaries have been very important for a lot of different reasons. So you talked to me when we were preparing for this, Terri, we talked about boundaries for nations. So tell us a little more about that.
Well, in the Bible, God gave specific instructions to each tribe, designating the boundary lines of their property, the amount of land that each tribe would own. And there's also another reference in the Bible to boundary markers. And there's a warning that says, uh, do not move the boundary markers that you find. Those are rigid. They cannot, must not be moved because you're messing with, something that isn't supposed to be uh, changed. So when I started thinking about that and this idea of boundaries, and there are even today boundaries for our yards. We have property lines. There's boundaries in schools. Relationships have boundaries. There's companies set boundaries for behavior. So we're surrounded with that. But the one thing I think that seems to escape boundaries is our emotional and mental arena.
Right, right. I think we accept it when it has to do with our country, our state, our city, our yard. I mean, for me out here in Indiana, there aren't a whole lot of boundaries in our yard, believe it or not. I've lived in a lot of places. We always had fences and stuff. There are no fences here, and people kind of run over your lawn. And I've had neighbors of mine come in and pick the fruit off my trees, you know. Um, yeah, there's no, and you do feel a little weird about that. You feel a little weird having somebody like I've had my neighbor on one side go through our yard with his daughter because the school is like right across the way from us. So
Okay.
he walks through our yard. It's just a thing that people do here in Indiana. And it's a little weird to us because are used to having those boundaries in our yard. But we do have boundaries when it comes to certain things in our lives. But I agree with you. We don't tend to have a good boundaries around our emotional and mental well-being, our emotional mental health. So tell us why that matters.
So it matters because, first of all, what you think usually evokes an emotion. And not every thought, like I have to go to the grocery store. Although some people really don't like to go to the grocery store, you know. But generally, there's certain thoughts, there's no emotional attachment, but there are plenty of thoughts that do. And what happens is, particularly if you're driving or you're in a place where you're not really paying attention to what you're thinking about, maybe vacuuming, I don't know, just folding the clothes, uh, doing some sort of rote work, that doesn't really need to occupy your mind, in the workplace. So you have this free space, right, where your brain starts thinking about stuff. And generally, what happens is those thoughts activate emotions. So, for instance, you start thinking about a conversation, and the next thing you know, you are actually reliving the emotions that you had with that conversation. Or um, music, you're listening to a song And then all of a sudden, in your mind, you start remembering the people you were with or what you were doing. And then all of a sudden, the emotions get activated. And
Right.
depending on that that experience, you can have good emotions or they can be very negative. So that's why I believe having boundaries is a protective measure.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And it's something that most people aren't talking about, which is like, I love that you're talking about this with us because it's not something we normally think about, but it is something that we always deal with. And I've had those. I mean, my mom passed away 7 months ago of Alzheimer's. So it was a horrible 10 years of her life and ours. And when I see things, it evokes an emotion. And it's usually a negative emotion right now as I'm grieving the loss of my mom. And there are things that we deal with that we do need to put boundaries around certain people, certain things, because if we don't, we get overwhelmed by that emotion, right? So tell us what the problem is a little bit more about why we need to reel those in, why we need to put those boundaries. What can happen if we don't?
So I'll give an example. Stories are always beneficial. In particular, when my mom passed away, it was 4 months after we moved from Ohio to South Carolina. And I had no idea that she was sick. And so after she died, you can imagine the regret, like the guilt. Well, if
Yeah.
I had known, what did I miss? Particularly as a nurse, right? What what didn't I see? Why didn't I know? Why didn't what and um it I knew that I had to trust God with that,
Yeah.
that the timing was right, but, the feelings were still there, and so I had to do a lot of work to not spiral down to a place where I was consumed with guilt and regret, because there was nothing I could do to change it. I had to
Right.
reconcile with the fact that, um and I just had to figure out a way to contain those emotions. And so now, when I think back, as I often do, because our moms are always our moms, um, as I start to, I'll be thinking about her and a fun time or a memory, but then it always goes back to that time in 2018. And I'm like, no, not doing this. And I mentally, um, I say stop. I say it out loud, stop. Though I'm not thinking that. And that sounds really weird, but I have to get my own attention, which is really ridiculous. But it's like the mind and the emotions take over and you become a victim. That's one of the key reasons why I think you want to have these boundaries, because especially particularly around shame and guilt, you you
Yes.
you are not your mind and your emotions are not the boss of you. But sometimes we end up feeling like we are a victim of our own thoughts and emotions.
Yes. I remember I went to with my health coaching community, I won a trip. I earned a trip uh, to the Bahamas, and it was a cruise. And we went off the ship, and we went. I guess it was the Bahamas where we were. They went to three different places, and my husband and I were together, and I was with a couple of the coaches on my team, and we went off the ship to the port. And in the port, there was a craft fair, and I lost it
Oh,
because my mom at the
oh,
time was dying. and she and I would go to craft fairs together. And my first thought was not, oh, look at these wonderful crafts and isn't this fun? And my mom and I used to have so much fun. That was not my first thought.
Yeah.
My first thought was, I'll never go to another craft fair with my mom. And so it can be debilitating because here I was in a great place with my husband of many years and my coaching family. I mean, these are not just business acquaintances, this is family for me. And I just had a really hard time recuperating from that. So tell us, as you've already started to tell us, we need to tell ourselves stop. We do, because otherwise we spiral out of control with these feelings that we feel like we can't control. So, what else do we do? How do we stop? How do we move past?
So you get to stop, don't think about it, and make that work by, and this is the hard part, wrestling with that feeling. Okay. So wrestling with it, letting it wash over you. I had a wonderful counselor that said, imagine the emotion as if it's a wave. Okay. An ocean wave. It washes over you and then it will recede. It will knock you down. The force of it may knock you down, but as it recedes, you will be able to rise. And I think that's a key part of it is because stopping it is good once you know that you don't have to feel that. But you don't want to press it down. You're not ignoring it. You have to come to terms with it. And sometimes that can only happen in counseling, depending on the depth of that emotion and experience and the length of time. There's so many factors. But uh particularly, wrestling with it. I'm just looking over here for a second. You know, boundaries are not suppression. And I
Yes,
really want to make that clear. You are establishing what will or will not, you know, become your identity, you know? Um,
I like
what
that.
what will not um be who you are as you move into the future, right? And I think particularly with like shame
Yeah,
and guilt, um, there were songs on the radio that would play rock songs, and these would remind me of times back in my, you know, uh, early 20s where I was, uh, didn't know God, hanging out, just doing stuff. But later on, as I reflected back on those relationships, those songs actually evoked emotions of shame. And then before I knew it, I it had completely changed my mood, how I felt about myself, and as if that was now it's like I took on that identity and shed the one that's true and real in this day. And so that's why I say but I had to come to terms with, I don't need to feel that way. That's not who I am now. And making those boundary statements, it's almost like you make those statements and you're putting the fence up all around
right.
and you're saying, okay, and all that emotion, those thoughts have to stay on the outside. And then that's when you say, when it tries to breach the fence, you're like, stop. I don't have to think that. I don't have to feel that.
I think
Um,
that's real important. What I want to back up a little bit because it's real important that people understand we're not saying you don't have to feel bad, that you never have to feel, and you think that is so important to hit home with. You need to process your emotions. I remember when my mom first passed, and it was, I'm not going to go into it here, but it was a horrific situation. And just the way that she did and what had happened and then what happened with her body afterward was very odd and unnerving. And so when I first was grieving, my instinct was, let's put that aside because that's making me feel bad. That's making it hard for me to do XYZ. So I'm just going to put that aside for I'm not going to deal with it right now. And I remember my coach, Mary, told me, you can't do that. She's lost her parents, and so she knew firsthand with mom, dad, but she also knew grieving and other aspects of it. And she kept trying to tell me, you need to process that with God first.
mhm.
Then it's easier. Like you were saying, the wave comes in, and I didn't want to feel that bad. So I
Yeah.
thought my instinct, put that aside and I don't have to deal with that anymore. But it kept coming up. And it's weird because God has a way of bringing things back to you because he's trying to get you to do something. And in my case, he was trying to get me to grieve the loss of my mom, deal with the loss of my mom, and get past that point where I feel like it's just controlling my whole being.
Yeah,
And so that's why this is so important because you don't need to stay stuck in it.
exactly.
And that's what the boundaries are for, right?
Right. And so boundaries can be time, right? Time limited. All right. Self-pity. Uh, that's an example. It's okay to feel sorry for yourself for a, a certain amount of time, but once and you have to control that. You have to say, It's okay. I'm hurt. I don't think that should have happened to me." But at some point, you have to move on. And so you have to set the time boundary as well and say, "Okay, it's time for me to move on." And as always, there are certain things that you can't move on until you work with a professional counselor. And I keep going back to that because you and I are not professional counselors.
No.
But the fact remains that there are certain things that we do, uh, we can control, how long we feel that way, processing it. But if you feel that that's not working for you, then you need to reach out and get help doing it because you will stay stuck. You won't be able to move forward. And there's no sense in you hurting longer than you need to, you
I
know?
think that's a great point because I do know that some things you can process through on your own, completely on your own with the Lord. Some things you can process through with the help of friends, family. And there comes time where you can't. You need professional help in order to process certain things. And there should be no shame in that. There used to be, back in my day, that was not something people would do or admit to. But nowadays we understand that is sometimes a normal process. And we should not feel bad about seeking that professional help if what we're doing isn't what we need.
Yes. And you have to remember that when you share your feelings or thoughts with people, it makes them uncomfortable and they want you to scoot along, right? They want
That's
you to
true.
move along a lot faster than you may be able to or willing to. And at that point, you have to ask yourself, is it still appropriate for me to continue to be harboring these feelings, to let it dictate my life, my identity. And, that question is very individualized, but it
Yes.
is worth asking because um I think, you know, our mind does not get to control us. Our emotions should not control us to the point where it's preventing us from living our best life.
And I think you brought up a really good point there too, just a minute ago that I want to reflect on. You said that people want you to just stop talking about it, move on. They're uncomfortable because they don't know how to help you. It's not necessarily that they think, oh, just get over it. It's just they are uncomfortable because they don't know how to help you. But one of the boundaries we may need to set, correct me if I'm wrong, is sharing that with certain people, sharing our pain or our difficulty with certain people, because either that those people, through no fault of their own really, can't help us or won't help us or make us feel worse about how we feel, right?
Uh we should, what did you say, we should share it or shouldn't?
No, I'm saying with certain people, there should be that boundary that we don't share it because they
Oh,
are not
yes.
being or can't be helpful.
Yes, they cannot. You have to be very mindful about who you can trust
Right.
with your feelings and thoughts. And so, I think that, when I was a nurse, there was a lot of things that people wouldn't tell their families because they didn't want to burden them, or they knew for a fact that their families couldn't bear it, right? The real thoughts and feelings. But sometimes it was a close friend. They would share their deepest
Yeah.
thoughts. And I'm talking about men and women, particularly men. They would be able to converse with maybe one man, one other man, but not with their wife or their family or anything about what they were feeling. So, or you have a feel for who's trustworthy. Um, but I would also caution, be careful not to overburden them, because some people want to fix you, and um, it's not their responsibility. And um, you need to do the work yourself. So
That's a very good point because there's a lot of times where that might be the case that you need to do the work to get past it, and in your time may be different than that person thinks it should be or could help you. And some people are just, they really want to help and they think that what they're doing is helpful, but really it's not giving you the opportunity to process your grief and move forward. So yeah, we need to be mindful of who we're sharing it with and to make sure that we are moving on or that we're not sharing it with anybody. That's
yeah,
another.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that could be another problem. If you really do need to share it with someone and you're not sharing it with anybody, and that's why you're not able to get past. So there's lots of everybody's different. I always say God did not make cookie cutter people. So there is no one size fits all when it comes to any health, anything really.
Yes, absolutely.
It's very individual. So you as an individual need to determine, am I not sharing enough? Am I sharing with the wrong people? Am I sharing too much? Am I spending too much time? Do I need to speak with a counselor?
Yes, very
Those,
important questions, very important questions.
okay. Yeah. I think that was a lot of really great information. I don't think this topic is handled very much at all. And I love the fact that you were willing to come on and share this with us. Do you have any final thoughts or questions or anything?
Um, no, I just there's a verse, Psalm 104:9, that says, "Then you, God, set a firm boundary for the seas, so they would never again cover the earth." And I think that's a great visual.
Yeah.
If the seas overwhelm the earth, we wouldn't even be able to exist. So keep that in mind as you think about your thoughts and emotions.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that visual. It makes a lot of sense because things can wash over you and drown you. So we
Yes.
need those boundaries. And
Yes.
we're gonna thank you so much for coming on with me and sharing all
Thank
of that.
you.
This has really been very helpful. I want to leave everybody with a challenge. So every time we come on, we are going to give you some thought-provoking information and some strategies and things to do, but we're also going to give you a challenge. And so this week's challenge is to think about what it is in your life that you need to set boundaries around and how you need to set those boundaries. And then go about making a plan to set those boundaries in place so that you can have a healthy emotional mental life, processing whatever it is that you're going through in the most healthful way, right?
Great challenge.
All righty. Well, I will be back next week, and Terry Hutchinson will be back twice next month to talk more about emotional things as well as spiritual. Thank you so much, Terry, for agreeing to come on twice a month to co-host with me.
Sure. Thank you for asking.
And if any of you want to check out her podcast is amazing. It's Anchored, Not Anxious, and it's available pretty much everywhere.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And we'll see you next week.
Okay.